Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. For tonight's game, we are playing with our patron Steven. He signed up to our Mox Pearl tier and gets to play with us for this episode. If you want to be on an episode of Playing with Power, consider signing up to our Mox Pearl tier today. This episode was made possible by all of our supporters over on Patreon. Our Patreon offers tons of benefits, including Discord access, live streams, behind-the-scenes footage, raw gameplay, additional gameplay series, merchandise discounts, and archive footage of old games as well. We have tiers at all budgets, so sign up today. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Folger piloting Najeela the Blade Blossom. This is a mid-range deck that looks to play Silver Bullet stacks pieces, snowball with Najeela, interact heavily, and eventually find one of the one-card win cons to pair with Najeela. His opening hand contains a Waterlogged Grove, Overgrown Tomb, Mana Crypt, Llanowar Elves, Ponder, Imperial Seal, and a Flusterstorm. Next, we have Zach piloting the partner pair of Kodama of the East Tree and Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. This is a land-based combo deck that looks to loop Sun-Scorched Desert with Kodama's ability to win the game. His opening hand contains a Somberwald Sage, Summoner's Pact, Jeweled Amulet, Jiraga Treespeaker, Cyclonic Rift, Ancient Tomb, and his London Mulligan is an Arbor Elf. After that we have Mike piloting Winota, Joiner of Forces. This is a stacks list that uses Winota's ability to both break parity and snowball your way to victory. His opening hand contains a Windswept Heath, Flooded Strand, Wear and Tear, a Braid, Ethersworn Canonist, Dockside Extortionist, and his London Mulligan is a Plains. Finally, we have Steven playing Nymris, Una's Trickster. This is a draw-go control list that uses its commander to generate card advantage while interacting. His opening hand contains an Ashiok Dreamrender, Misty Rainforest, Morphic Pool, Muddle the Mixture, Watery Grave, Imperial Seal, and an Island. Without further ado, let's begin this candid, captivating, cerebral, charmed clash of cluelessness. Folger wins the MTG Family Feud Extravaganza and gets to start us off. Folger draws a card for turn and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps it to cast Ponder. He looks at the top three, doesn't like what he sees, and shuffles. He draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He passes. Zach draws a card for turn and casts a Jeweled Amulet. He plays an Oboro, Palace in the Clouds. He ends his turn. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Giver of Runes and ships the turn to Steven. Steven draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts an Imperial Seal. Steven fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He passes the turn. During his upkeep, Folger wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his own Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library as well and loses 2 life. He ends the turn. At the end of Folger's turn, Zach puts a charge counter onto his Jeweled Amulet. Zach draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Sacred Foundry onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Ethersworn Canonist. Mike passes. Steven draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Vault. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Folger wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws for turn and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He passes. Zach draws, sighs, and passes. Mike draws and casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Mike creates 3 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Folger with the Canonist. Folger doesn't block and takes the hit. Mike ships the turn. Steven draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Drowned Catacombs. He passes to Folger. During his upkeep, Folger wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Temple Garden into play tapped. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Najeela. Najeela triggers and Folger creates a warrior tapped and attacking Zach. Zach takes it, and in his second main phase, Folger casts an Elvish Mystic. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps it and Ancient Tomb to cast Somberwald Sage. Zach passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Folger with the Mind Sensor and Canonist. Folger takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts a Phyrexian Revoker. It enters, and Mike names Najeela the Blade Blossom. He ends his turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Steven flashes in his commander, Nymris, Una's Trickster. During his draw step, Steven takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Island. He passes to Folger. At the end of Steven's turn, Folger cracks his Waterlogged Grove and draws a card. During his upkeep, Folger wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Najeela and his warrior. Najeela triggers and Folger creates 2 more warriors tapped and attacking Zach. Zach takes it all, and in his second main phase, Folger casts an Elves of Deep Shadow. He ends the turn. Zach draws and plays a snow-covered island. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast his commander, Kodama of the East Tree. Zach passes. Mike draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. In response, Folger decides to cast Silence, preventing Mike from snowballing out of control for a turn. Silence resolves and Jeweled Lotus resolves. Mike moves to combat and attacks Folger with Mind Sensor. Folger takes the hit and Mike ends his turn. During his draw step, Steven takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He holds open mana and passes to Folger. During his upkeep, Folger wins his Mana Crypt flip again. He draws for turn and moves to combat. At the beginning of combat, Zach taps Waterlogged Grove to cast Cyclonic Rift, targeting Najeela. In response, Folger casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Cyclonic Rift. Steven responds by casting Muddle the Mixture, targeting the original Flusterstorm. Nymris triggers, and Steven looks at the top 2 cards of his library, puts one into his hand and an island into his graveyard. Muddle counters Flusterstorm, Zach removes the counter from Jeweled Amulet to pay for the copy of Flusterstorm, and Cyclonic Rift bounces Najeela to Folger's hand. With nothing else, Folger passes the turn. Zach draws and casts his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. Sakashima resolves and enters as a copy of Kodama of the East Tree. Kodama triggers, and Zach puts a Prime Speaker Zagana onto the battlefield. Zagana and Kodama trigger. Zach resolves Zagana first, putting 6 +1/+1 counters onto her, and then drawing 7 cards. Zach puts a Kinnan Bonder Prodigy onto the battlefield, triggering Kodama. He puts an Allosaurus Shepherd onto the battlefield, triggering Kodama. He puts a Jiraga Tree Speaker onto the battlefield, triggering Kodama again. He puts an Expedition Map onto the battlefield, triggering Kodama. Zach puts a Welding Jar onto the battlefield, triggering Kodama. He puts an island onto the battlefield, triggering Kodama. He puts a Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, ignoring the last Kodama trigger. He moves to combat and attacks Folger with Kodama. Folger takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach taps Waterlogged Grove to level up Jiraga Tree Speaker. He ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and cracks Jeweled Lotus for 3 red. He casts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. In response, Steven casts Mana Drain, targeting Winota. Nymris triggers, and Steven looks at the top 2 cards of his library, puts one into his hand, and puts a command tower into his graveyard. Mana Drain counters Winota, and Mike moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Mind Sensor. Folger takes it, and Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Folger flashes in an Opposition Agent. During his draw step, Steven takes a damage from his Mana Vault. During his main phase, he adds 4 colorless mana through Mana Drain. He plays a Cephalid Coliseum. He casts a Dark Confidant. He passes to Folger. During his upkeep, Folger wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He recasts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. Folger moves to combat and attacks Steven with 3 warriors. Najeela triggers, and Folger creates 3 more warriors tapped and attacking Steven. Steven blocks 1 warrior with Nymris, killing it, and takes the rest. Folger ends his turn. At the end of Folger's turn, Zach puts a counter onto his Jeweled Amulet. Zach draws and casts a Storm Cauldron. In response, Steven cracks a Cephalid Coliseum. He draws 3 and discards 3. With Storm Cauldron still on the stack, Steven casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Storm Cauldron. Nymris triggers, and he looks at the top 2, puts 1 into his hand, and 1 into his graveyard. Fierce Guardianship counters Storm Cauldron, and Zach moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Zagana. Folger chump blocks with the Elves of Deep Shadow, and Zach passes the turn. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Aven Mind Sensor. Folger takes it, and Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Steven casts a Tainted Pact. Nymris triggers, and he looks at the top 2, puts 1 into his hand and 1 into his graveyard. Tainted Pact resolves, and he exiles until he hits a Pact of Negation. He puts it into his hand, and the turn passes to Steven. During his upkeep, Steven reveals an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth through Dark Confidant, and puts it into his hand. During his draw step, Steven takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He casts Toxic Deluge, where X equals 7, paying 7 life. It resolves and wipes every creature on the battlefield. He plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and then ships the turn to Folger. At the end of Steven's turn, Folger cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield tapped. During his upkeep, Folger finally loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts a Wild Growth onto his Overgrown Tomb. He casts Llanowar Elves. He recasts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. Folger passes. At the end of Folger's turn, Zach taps Waterlogged Grove to cast Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Hull Breacher onto the top of his library. Zach draws and casts Hull Breacher. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Time Twister. In response, Mike casts a Braid, dealing 3 damage to Hull Breacher, killing it. Time Twister resolves, each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, and draws 7. Zach plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts an Allosaurus Shepherd. He taps Waterlogged Grove to cast a Mana Vault. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Hushbringer. Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Steven pays to untap his Mana Vault. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. Steven passes to Folger. During his upkeep, Folger wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Drannith Magistrate. In response, Steven taps Ancient Tomb to flash in his commander, Nymris, Una's Trickster. Drannith resolves, and Folger follows it up by casting an Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Llanowar Elves as an additional cost. Folger fetches up an Edric, Spymaster of Trest, onto the battlefield. He moves to combat, and at the beginning of combat, Mike casts Path to Exile, targeting Najeela. Folger responds by hard casting Force of Negation. Force of Negation then counters and exiles Path. Folger attacks Zack with Najeela. Najeela triggers and creates a warrior tapped and attacking Zack. Zack takes the hit and Edric triggers twice. Folger draws 2 cards, and in his second main phase, he casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Misty Rainforest. Folger ends his turn. Zack draws and casts a Tezzeret the Seeker. He activates Tezzeret's first ability to untap Mana Vault. He casts a Storm Cauldron. It resolves this time, and Zack taps Snow-Covered Forest for green. Storm Cauldron triggers, and Zack bounces it to his hand. He replays the Snow-Covered Forest. He taps the forest and returns it to his hand from the Cauldron trigger. He cracks Expedition Map and fetches up an Inventor's Fair into his hand. He plays Inventor's Fair and passes. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zack with Hushbringer. Zack takes it, Mike gains a life, and Edric triggers. Mike draws a card, and in his second main phase, he plays a mountain. He plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He stares down the Storm Cauldron and passes to Steven. During his draw step, Steven takes the damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Sunken Ruins and moves to combat. He attacks Mike with Nymris. Mike takes it and Edric triggers. Steven draws a card, and in his second main phase, he casts a Gilded Drake. Cauldron triggers, and Steven returns 2 lands to his hand. Gilded Drake enters, and Steven targets Najeela. Unfortunately, the table reminds him of the Hushbringer, and Gilded Drake actually doesn't trigger. Steven then passes the turn, wishing he could be like the Playing with Power guys who never misplay. Yeah, that's not true at all. At the end of Steven's turn, Folger taps Mana Confluence to cast Assassin's Trophy, targeting Storm Cauldron. Cauldron triggers, and Folger returns Mana Confluence to his hand. In response, Zack cracks Welding Jar to regenerate his Storm Cauldron. Assassin's Trophy resolves, and Zack fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. Folger sighs, laughs at himself for trash-talking Welding Jar earlier in the game, and then Steven discards the hand size, passing to Folger. During his upkeep, Folger loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He swings the team at Mike. Najeela triggers, and Folger creates 2 more warriors tapped and attacking Mike. Mike responds by casting Red Elemental Blast, targeting Edric. Cauldron triggers, and Mike returns a mountain to his hand. Folger responds by casting Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Red Elemental Blast. In response, Steven taps Ancient Tomb to cast Negate, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Cauldron triggers, and Steven returns Ancient Tomb and Watery Grave to his hand. Nymris triggers, and in response, Folger casts Swan Song, targeting Negate. Swan Song counters Negate, and Steven creates a 2/2 bird. Nymris' trigger resolves, and Steven looks at the top 2, puts 1 into his hand and the other into his graveyard. Fierce Guardianship then counters Red Elemental Blast. Mike doesn't block, and before damage, Folger activates Najeela. Cauldron triggers, and Folger returns 4 lands to his hand, putting Wild Growth into his graveyard. In response, Zack taps Ancient Tomb to crack Waterlogged Grove. Cauldron triggers, and Zack bounces Ancient Tomb to his hand. He draws a card, but doesn't find a way to interact. Folger untaps his attacking creatures. They gain haste, lifelink, and trample, and Folger gets an additional combat step. Mike takes the hit, Folger gains 9 life, and Edric triggers 6 times. Folger draws 6 cards and moves to a second combat step. He attacks Mike with Drannith and the warrior tokens, and attacks Tezzeret with Najeela and Edric. Najeela triggers, and Folger creates 4 more warriors tapped and attacking Mike. Zack chump blocks Najeela with Allosaurus Shepherd. Tezzeret takes 2, and Mike takes it all. Folger gains 9 more life, and Edric triggers 8 times. Folger draws 8 cards and moves to a second main phase. He plays an Exotic Orchard. He plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Soul Ring. Folger passes the turn, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Zack gains a life through Inventor's Fair. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He activates Tezzeret's first ability to untap Mana Vault. He casts a Windfall. Cauldron triggers, and Zack returns an island to his hand. Windfall resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 9 cards. Zack casts a Grim Monolith, returning 2 lands to his hand. Zack casts an Aesi, Tyrant of Gyre Strait. Cauldron triggers, and Zack returns his last 3 lands to his hand. He plays a Misty Rainforest. Aesi triggers, and Zack draws. He cracks Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Aesi triggers, and Zack draws. He plays a forest, triggering Aesi and drawing a card. He plays an Oboro, Palace in the Clouds. Aesi triggers, and Zack draws. He ends his turn, discarding to hand size. Mike draws and plays a mountain. He plays a Flooded Strand. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand and makes it red. Mike casts a Spirit of the Labyrinth. Cauldron triggers, and Mike returns Command Tower to his hand. Mike cracks his flooded strand, paying a life, and fetches up a plains onto the battlefield. He casts a Phyrexian Revoker. Cauldron triggers again, and Mike bounces 2 lands to his hand. Revoker enters, and Mike names Najeela. Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Steven casts Intuition. Cauldron triggers, and Steven bounces his last 3 lands to his hand. Nymris triggers, and with it on the stack, Folger casts Runaway Together, targeting Aesi and the Spirit of the Labyrinth. Cauldron triggers, and Folger returns Command Tower to his hand. Runaway Together resolves and bounces Aesi and Spirit to their owner's hands. Nymris' trigger resolves, Steven looks at the top 2, puts 1 into his hand and 1 into his graveyard. Intuition resolves, and Steven fetches up Thassa's Oracle, Jin-Gitaxi's Core Augur, and a Toxic Deluge. Mike gives him Deluge, and the rest go to his graveyard. The turn then passes to Steven. During his draw step, Steven takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Morphic Pool. He casts a Soul Ring. He taps his Morphic Pool for black, and with the Cauldron trigger on the stack, Folger responds by casting Silence, returning Exotic Orchard to his hand. Silence resolves, and Steven returns his Morphic Pool to his hand. Now unable to cast his Toxic Deluge, Steven plays an Underground Sea. He decides to hold back blockers, and ends his turn, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Folger wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. Folger taps Mana Confluence to cast Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Cauldron triggers, and Folger returns his last 3 lands to his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Najeela, Edric, Draneth, and 5 warriors, and Mike with 2 warriors. Najeela triggers and creates 8 more warriors tapped and attacking Mike. Mike blots 1 warrior with Hushbringer. Zach takes the hit and dies, and Mike takes the rest. Derevi and Edric trigger 17 times. Folger has every Derevi trigger target Mox Diamond and orders the Edric triggers to resolve after the first Derevi trigger. He untaps Mox Diamond once with Derevi and then uses it to cast Vampiric Tutor. Folger fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Edric's triggers then resolve and Folger draws 17 cards. Derevi untaps Mox Diamond 16 more times and Folger floats 16 mana of varying colors. He casts an Abrupt Decay, destroying Phyrexian Revoker. At the end of combat, he activates Najeela with his floating mana. Folger moves to his next combat phase and swings out at Mike and Steven, killing them both and winning the game. It is Patreon shoutout time. I'd like to give a shout out to Nathan Smith, Elijah Miller, J-Rock, Pyro, Dark, Philip Hickey, Brad Tobin, Sanguina Lindsay, Snarps the Cleft, Matt Wingrove, Delph Driz, Dante, Jared Smith, Baby Jeebus, Rakeko, Greg Babe, Zods, Wayan, Spielrahu, Sparks, CZ, and Nick. Thank you all very much.